It's really an honor to be here today, this evening at Burlington Meeting House. And I'd like to thank the Burlington Monthly Meeting for the invitation and for C for helping me work through the technology. And she has set everything up really nicely. I'd also like to recognize that we are on Lenape ground here. We are in the Lenape homeland. For most of my life, I've lived in the Lenape homeland, and it's a beautiful, beautiful place to live. And I think we need to remember that this was the Lenape's first, and that over time, unfortunately, it has changed a great deal. But Lenapes still do live in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, as well as Oklahoma and other parts of North America. And I have talked with them and read their works to help me, along with the documents that have been written by Europeans, to do my research, to do the work that I'll be talking about tonight. The one point, though, about these European documents, the maps, the deeds, the reports back to Europe, all had biases that we have to remember. And it means that whatever we quote from something that a Lenape said in the past or something that a Lenape did was filtered through what a European wrote or said. And so we have to, as much as we can, as historians and as scholars and as people thinking, reading about these issues, that people in the 17th century and 18th century were biased in receiving what they heard, what they saw, just as we are today. I mean, historians today have to note that they also have biases. And so I welcome the discussion that we'll have afterwards, to talk about different perspectives about these issues. Okay, I'd like to start tonight with 3 quotations. And we're going to use the PowerPoint through most of the talk. And I think that will help provide some more structure as we move through the material. The first is from 1757, which was the middle of the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, when the Lenapes, along with many other native groups, went to war against the English colonists. In Pennsylvania, there were some attacks in northwestern New Jersey as well, but more in the Ohio Valley and what we know as Western Pennsylvania and Ohio today. The governor of Pennsylvania was trying to negotiate an end to the war in 1757. So he called Lenapes together, and he was speaking with 2 New Jersey Lenapes at one point, Tidiascon and Quaquiponin. And he asked, okay, why are you attacking us? And Tidiascon, who was considered the main leader, he was called the king of the Lenapes at one point, spoke initially, and he said, "You may easily see the reason of these gloomy and dark days. They have proceeded from the earth, as well as from our differences and grievances that have passed and repassed." And he wasn't specific enough for the governor, so the governor asked Quaquiponin for an interpretation, an explanation. And what Quaquiponin said was that the principal reason for war was the expropriation of Lenape land. And the quotation, "And though the first settlers might purchase the lands fairly, yet they did not act well, nor do the Indians justice, for they ought to have reserved some place for the Indians. So here the point was, it wasn't that the settlers had moved in, but rather that they pushed the Lenapes out entirely, away from the rich lands, the rich agricultural lands of the Delaware Valley, the west bank of New Jersey and the eastern bank of Pennsylvania. And this was a critique that the Lenapes had of European English, especially colonization, through the 17th century, as epidemic disease hit the Lenapes and drove down their population, and with the expectation that they would vacate the land. Few English settlers were willing to make allowance that the Europeans were in any way at fault for the decline in population and really the decline in Lenape communities. They believed, many of them wrote, or some of them wrote, and it seems as though many believed that it was God's providence that had opened up the land to the English colonists by destroying Lenape lives. And I want to discuss two quotes from John Woolman here. One dates from 1746, from his first essay against slavery. And here he had adopted the beliefs that God's providence had opened up the land for the colonists. And his quotation is, "He that sleeps not by day nor night hath watched over us and kept us as the apple of his eye. The wilderness and solitary deserts in which our fathers passed the days of their pilgrimage are now turned into pleasant fields. The natives are gone from before us, and we establish peaceably in the possession of the land, enjoying our civil and religious liberties." And this is still in 1746, before the 7 Years' War. And he says, "And while many parts of the world have groaned under the heavy calamities of war, our habitation remains quiet and our land fruitful." So here, before war, John Woolman, as a young man, was expressing that, God favored them. And one indication of that was that he had opened up this land for them. By 1763, however, when he returned to Burlington County after his trip to Wyalusing, he had recognized the situation of the native people of the Lenapes from New Jersey and Pennsylvania. He had also traveled up and down the East Coast. And he says in his quotation, it's not all on the screen, but he surveyed a prospect of the English along the coast for upward of 900 miles where I have traveled. And the favorable situation of the English compared with the difficulties of native people and African Americans were open before me. And here luxury and covetousness with the numerous oppressions and other evils attending them, next slide, appeared very afflicting to me. And I felt that that which is immutable, that the seeds of great calamity and desolation are sown and growing fast on this continent. So by 1763, John Woolman had done what I don't think any other English person had done, which was, one, to connect the oppression of African Americans and Native Americans. And he had recognized that the Lenapes had lost ground, had lost a great deal by the colonization of the Delaware Valley. Could you, okay. So there's no good portrait of a Lenape from the 17th century, which is the time period that I'll be discussing for the most part. But this portrait of Tish Cohan, Lenape sachem, who in 1735 lived in the Lehigh Valley, is probably quite an accurate depiction of a Lenape sachem at that time. There's another portrait as well of another sachem from the same area, Wyalusing. Both of these portraits were done by Gustavus Hesselius, a Swede, and they were painted during the time that the walking purchase was being negotiated. And it's clear from their eyes that they are feeling very, very sad about the situation. And Hesselius is, I think, has done quite a good job of indicating the situation in which the Lenapes found themselves at that time. We can also see that Tish Cohan was wearing a cloth garment, which was quite accurate for the time period. Lenapes increasingly used European cloth after 1650. And that was a major trade good for the Lenapes and the Europeans. The Lenape country that I have studied for the most part is the lower Delaware. Lenape country actually extends from southern New York, eastern Long Island, to the northern stretch of Delaware Bay in what we call Delaware today, and of course, eastern Pennsylvania as well. Some historians, other scholars will say the Muntzees lived in the region north of, say, Trenton to Navasinks, that area. And that's quite accurate. Unamis were the group who lived to the south from about Trenton and the Lehigh Valley south along the west bank of the Delaware Valley and through New Jersey, through what we call southern New Jersey, into northern Delaware. There are a number of groups shown on the map on the screen, including the Sankakans, the Armawamis, the Naratikans, the Cohanses or Cohansiks. These groups, while their names are shown on this map on the New Jersey side, held land on the west bank as well. So that the Armawamis, just for an example, their territory was where Philadelphia is today and where northern Gloucester County and Camden County are today. So it wasn't a fact of being divided by the Delaware. Rather, the Delaware River was the main thoroughfare for Lenapes for 12,000 years into the 17th century. And so it wasn't a boundary. It was the way, it was their main street, basically. During the 17th century, we can see a series of Europeans who came to the Delaware Valley. The Dutch entered in 1615, then the Swedes came in 1638. The Dutch then conquered New Sweden, and then the English, Duke of York, conquered the Dutch. So there was a series of small colonies in the Delaware Valley from 1615 up until the 1670s. During that time period, the Dutch and the Swedes learned the expectations of the Lenapes. And we see that there were actually two models of colonization here, whereas in some other colonies, you only see one model of colonization, but there were two here. One was that much favored by the Lenapes, which is sharing the land, basically having a situation where the Lenapes would trade for goods with the Europeans. Generally, they would receive annual presents or rent, we might say, for the use of a limited amount of land. The Lenapes ideally wanted to trade enough land for the Europeans to subsist agriculturally, to live, to have a decent living, and to erect a trading fort because the Lenapes were interested in trade, ongoing trade. The other model that we see is one that came in with the English later in the 17th century. But the Dutch initially were hoping to establish that plantation model, the second model of colonization, but learned very quickly that they didn't have the power in order to impose that on the Lenapes. What happened is that in 1631, the Dutch decided that they were going to start a plantation at Swannendale or Cape Henlopen at the mouth of Delaware Bay on the Delaware side. They hoped eventually to create a plantation similar to what had been started in Virginia by that time by the English. Wanted to grow tobacco, wanted to whale, and take over the land, basically. They went over to Cape May and made a deal there as well with Lenapes, hoping to establish two different plantations on either side of the Delaware Bay. In 1631, there was a disagreement. The Lenapes, I would argue, learned what the Dutch were planning to do. They knew what had happened in Virginia, and they they killed everyone at the plantation in Swannendale. There were 32 men there at the time. And they went there and killed them all and made it clear that Europeans were not going to establish plantations in the Delaware Valley. The Dutch then came, again, they had been trading since 1615, and the following year a trader came, made peace, established trade again, and when the Swedes came, they knew what had happened at Swannendale, and they kept their colony small. For the Swedes, it wasn't just a matter of that knowledge of Swannendale. They also lacked the support on a continuing basis from Sweden. But even when the Dutch took over the colony in Delaware in 1655, I have found documents where the Dutch would say, when anyone would say, well, we should import more, bring in more immigrants, just clear cut the land, create a plantation colony, someone would say, well, we have to remember Swannendale. And we know that we have to have the numbers of people to impose that kind of regime on the Lenapes. The Lenapes remained much more numerous in the Delaware Valley than the Europeans until the 1680s. This slide shows the comparisons in terms of the populations in different colonies. You can see that in 1670, in Pennsylvania and Delaware, there were 850 people. Well, that was about the total population of the Delaware Valley in terms of Europeans at the time. There were maybe 20 people, 25 people in West New Jersey at that point of time. That is 20 or 30 Europeans. So less than 900 people lived in the Delaware Valley in 1670, compared with 52,000 Europeans and African Americans in New England, and 41,000 in Virginia and Maryland. So the Lenapes had managed to keep the population quite small in the Delaware Valley. The equivalent Lenape population, the estimate for 1600 is that there were 8,000 Lenapes in the southern region on the lower Delaware. And because of European diseases, that number declined to at least 4,000 by 1650. And my estimate is that there were still about 3,000 Lenapes in the lower Delaware region by 1670. Unfortunately, that number continued to decline because of the diseases, but the Lenapes stayed strong in the lower Delaware, and they used their influence. And I want to talk more about that. But before I do that, I just want to show you a map that was composed by Augustine Hermann, who was a Bohemian merchant who settled first in New Netherland. And he produced a map of the Mid-Atlantic region dated 1670 for Lord Baltimore. It's headlined, it's titled A Map of Virginia and Maryland. But you can see in the northeast corner, the west is at the top, okay. At the northeast corner is New Jersey, the Delaware Valley. And the next slide gives you more okay, that'll do. No, can you go back once? Yeah, please. Okay, great. This slide shows that northeast corner of Hermann's map. And when I saw it, this actually is on the cover of my book, Lenape Country, because it's so important. And again, the top shows the west, and you see Delaware Bay and the Delaware River. And at the bottom, you see the coastline of New Jersey. And on this map here, this detail, you can see his quotation. It would be on the right-hand side toward the bottom of the map, where he says, New Jersey part at present inhabited only or most by Indians. And so Hermann, who knew the area well, right there, yes, knew that the whole area was Lenape country. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see the wigwams that he drew along numerous streams a little bit better here with the larger detail, right? He shows towns, the Cohansik towns. He shows towns along Morris River, then on the Rancocas, and he points out that the Rancocas and Mantes people lived on the Rancos, right by the J of there. And at first I thought he was simply trying to show us, give us some kind of idea of where Lenape towns were. But I've done a lot of research using New Jersey deeds, the early deeds, and this is really accurate. I mean, it's really quite accurate. And so that this map provides good evidence of where the Lenapes were, and it shows us that they still, it was their homeland. And the Europeans who came in were visiting, basically. Okay, despite the change for Lenapes in the 17th century, especially with the decline in population, there were important elements of their culture that remained the same, important parts of their political framework that remained the same, in that they were a sovereign people. Unlike some natives in Eastern North America, the Lenapes never pledged allegiance to another king, never pledged allegiance to the English king, pretended they weren't there, basically, until well into the 18th century. They also protected their personal liberty within the context of community. Men and women chose marriage partners, and they could both divorce easily. They opposed slavery, absolutely, as well as forced adoption for themselves and for others. They believed in religious liberty and refused to convert to Christianity. Some never converted. I mean, today, many have not converted, but some did convert to Presbyterianism and Moravianism in the middle of the 18th century. They absolutely believed in reciprocity, and this was at the basis of their treaties for land and for trade. And they expected, as part of that reciprocal agreement, to continue to live in their homeland. That was their expectation, to live there, to plant, to hunt, and to fish. They looked for peaceful ways to resolve conflict, but they didn't shy away from using violence or the threat of violence. And of course, Swannondale was one example of that, and probably the most, it was definitely the most violent episode during the 17th century. But it remained there as a useful threat, as did periodic mourning war that the Lenapes, through which the Lenapes would make it clear that Europeans had trespassed on their land or had committed some other wrong. Okay, what I'd like to do is talk about several deeds to give examples of how Lenapes used their power to make it clear to Europeans, this reciprocal relationship. Okay, and one was the Cohanzic deed with John Fenwick. Actually, there were three major deeds with John Fenwick by the Cohanzics. And in two of them, I do have a slide, in two of them, they made it clear to him, as the founder of this new, rather small colony, English Quaker colony at Salem, that they would continue to live in the area. And they had him write that into the deeds, into two of the deeds, so that the deed, the first deed for the area that became Salem included the quotation, "Accepted always out of this grant the plantations in which they now inhabit, for and until such time only as they shall think fit to remove from the same." Now, because of decline in population, Cohanzics merged their communities to the Cohansey area along the Cohansey River. But to my knowledge, they kept land there and towns there through the 18th century. And that's really the limit of my study at this point. But there is now on the Cohansey River a community of Lenni Lenapes and Nanticokes and a large group of people whose ancestors were the Cohanzics who dealt with Fenwick. So, and then these deeds also included goods such as woolens, linen cloth, clothing, shoes, rum, guns, lead, powder, and other commodities. And these goods were standard. As far as I can tell, they stayed fairly standard through the 17th century as part of the deeds. And that would be because that is what the Lenapes wanted. And it took time for John Fenwick to obtain his final deed. Generally, people will date the deed from November 17th, 1675, but there had to be two more documents written, and the final one is in March 1676 for the same land because of requirements by the Lenapes, and he had to make sure that he was dealing with the correct people, and he wasn't at first. He was just kind of writing the names of Lenape sachems at the top, of the deeds, and then people would refuse to sign because they weren't the true owners of the land, and they would not sign if they weren't the true owners. Okay, the next deed I'd like to discuss briefly is the one for Petty Island, which is located, of course, between what is now Pennsauken and Philadelphia, Shackamaxon. It was called it was called Shackamaxon Island at the time. And there aren't any original deeds for the land, the large territories of land from Oldman's Creek up to Assunpink Creek. So we don't know what the details of those deeds were. We know what goods were involved. We know which commissioners were involved in dealing with the Lenapes, and we know pretty much who the Lenape sachems were, who signed, but all we have are abstracts in the New Jersey archives. So we don't know the details. But this deed for Petty's Island provides interesting details. It's just a year after those 1677 deeds. And it's to Elizabeth Kinsey, who was about 18 years old at the time. She had come with her father, who died very quickly after they arrived. They were members of Burlington Monthly Meeting. She then married Thomas Fairman, who had been here, a Quaker, and they settled in Shackamaxon, which was on the west side of the Delaware, and is land that her father had originally selected, even though he came as a West Jersey commissioner. In any case, I just briefly want to point out what the deal was in terms of this deed. And Kinsey paid for Lenape sachems the equivalent of 15 pounds, which is quite different from the other deeds, which included trade goods. But it's probably she didn't have any trade goods, so they took the money and would buy those goods from traders. And they would continue, it says in the deed, they would continue to hunt, fish, and dig for tuckahoe, which are edible roots, on the island. Kinsey, on an annual basis, would provide rum, a small amount of rum and a small amount of gunpowder annually. And in return, they would protect her hogs from being killed and her hay from being burned. So it was a reciprocal relationship that was written into this deed. It was written into some other deeds that I won't have time to discuss here, individual deeds. And so this was, a way in which individuals, Quakers and other English people and the Lenapes dealt with one another. One of these Lenape sachems was a woman. I found that from a confirmation from 20 years later, which I have that as a slide. Under her mark, or Iroquois mark, the English scribe, the next one then, the English scribe has her mark there. And so it's clear that women, though not too often, were negotiating with the English. They did, in fact, at times negotiate for land and for other trade. This confirmation actually comes 20 years later, and Thomas Fairman, Kinsey's husband, wants the confirmation so that he can get a patent from William Penn. And in this confirmation, Iroquois agrees to accept an ear of corn instead of what she had been receiving. Elizabeth and Thomas had changed the terms from gunpowder and rum to one match coat, which was a good annual payment for the Lenapes for Petty Island. But after the 20 years, Iroquois, because of the declining fortunes of Lenapes at that point, Iroquois agreed to accept 1 ear of corn if required. Okay, so one other deed that we could think about some is and I think also underscores the relationships between the Quakers and Lenapes, was that of William Penn. The famous painting of Benjamin West really is a depiction that never occurred. You know, there are elements that are obviously false. There weren't any brick buildings in Philadelphia like that in 1682. And Penn is portrayed here as the paternalistic figure, you know, giving the Lenapes these gifts. And in fact, he did not have power over the Lenapes at this time. This was a reciprocal relationship, and they were trading when they did trade with Penn. And cloth, definitely, as you can see at the center of this painting, was important as a trade good. But the first deed between Penn's government and the Lenapes occurred before he arrived. And it was between his deputy governor, William Markham, and Lenapes. And if you go to the next slide, and it was for the area of southern Bucks County. This is Holmes' map of Pennsylvania. And the land that was purchased first by William Penn was the lower part of Bucks County, which is on the lower right part of this map. Again, the west is at the top of the map. And at this treaty, there were important principles agreed between the Lenapes and the Pennsylvania government. And they, again, emphasized the reciprocal nature of the deals that were being made. In this case, what's been called the Great Treaty, we can see elements of the Great Treaty here as well, because the Lenapes pledged to give notice of other Indians threatened Pennsylvania. They insisted that there be an annual meeting to review the agreement and to provide annual payment. Everyone agreed that the others could have free passage across lands. You know, Indians, Lenapes could come into Philadelphia freely, and the colonists could pass through Lenape lands as long as on both sides no damage was done. And if there was damage done, there would be peaceful resolution of conflict. So, I mean, we see good plans, intentions by the early colonists. But again, it's true that by the 1750s, things had gone awry. And it had been a concern for many decades by that point that the colonists had simply taken all the land, all the rich land on both sides of the river. And so it was quite right for Kaukonen and Tidiaskun to say that the early colonists should have reserved some place for the Indians.
You mentioned that there's no deed for Oldman's Creek to Assunpink Creek.
There's no original deed.
No original deed.
Yeah, although I moved over that material pretty quickly, but there were actually 3 deeds that were negotiated. One from Oldman's to Timber, then Timber to Rancocas, and then Rancocas to Assunpink. And in each case, the land would go to the heads of the creeks, although that had to be negotiated again in 1703. But basically, we're talking about that area, the intercoastal plain, the richest area of South Jersey. So we don't have the original deeds. What we have are abstracts that are recorded. Abstracts were recorded in the deeds that we have in the state library. And so we don't, at least no one who I know has the original deeds, the signed deeds. There was a fire in Gloucester in about 1696. Whether they may have been there, I don't know. John Redding's house caught fire, and he was a clerk of, I guess it was Gloucester County, but he also held other positions, like he may have been the clerk for the West Jersey, the Council of West Jersey Proprietors at that point as well. So the deeds may have been there, but that's just a guess on my part.
There's two questions. I'll read them because they're probably far for you. Was the language in the Woolman quote at the beginning edited, or did he use the term African Americans?
Oh, it was edited. It was a longer phrase, and I think he used Negroes with this, a lowercase n.
Mm-hmm.
At least, yeah.
And there's another question here. Where are the current Lenape Cohansey living in New Jersey today? You mentioned there is a community, I believe somewhere along the Jersey Shore. Is it an open community that we can visit?
It's the Nanticoke Lenni Lenape Tribal Nation, and you can Google that name, and you can find a great deal of information about them. They have an office in Bridgeton, and they have tribal grounds at Fairton, which is on the east side of Cohansey River. And I think it's good to call the office or call the number to make an appointment to talk with someone. But Reverend John Norwood is very active publicly, and he's a great person to talk with. He's also authored a book about the history of the Nanticoke and Cohansey people, Cohansic people, coming up to today.
So you said that abstracts are in the state library?
The archives, the New Jersey State Archives. They are, there's a book by Frank Stewart, Indians of South Jersey, and it's been reprinted. And Gloucester County Historical Society last reprinted it, I think in about 1980. And if you called them, you might be able to get a copy of it from them. But it, in the back, Frank Stewart did transcriptions of quite a few Indian deeds. And he did transcriptions of those 3 abstracts. And they're quite good, his transcriptions.
There's a question here. I live close to the Manasquan and Meetingroom River. Were these rivers named after tribes that lived in this area? Within this area is Brick.
Okay.
Brick Township.
Yeah, I haven't studied that area in detail. My guess is that they were the names that the Lenapes of that area gave. They would have been Navasinks, and they would have given those names to those areas. Like a lot of the place names that we have in New Jersey that have an unk or an ing or ung on the end are Lenape names. And even those like Rancocas was also a Lenape name, but it's changed obviously through the English.
So the along both sides of the Delaware River was the prized, the valued land for both the colonists and the Lenape.
Well, it's the good agricultural land. I mean, it's not all uniformly great. we live in West Deptford, which is near the Mantua Creek, just north of, and there's a lot of wetlands there, and there were lots of wetlands there too. So not all of the land along the east bank of the Delaware was uniformly wonderful, but it was the best agricultural land of West Jersey, from Burlington County south to Salem County, was there. And that's the intercoastal plain. When you go farther east, then you get into the Pinelands. And there's a mixture there. Right? There's some good agricultural land, but other resources abound there. And so people could make livings through cedar swamps, use of woods, hunting, fishing, gathering berries. So.
Well, I hike in the Pine Barrens and I barely see a squirrel. It seems pretty desolate.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know if that was the case at the time, but.
The early English and Dutch explorers wrote about all of the birds and the deer and other animals, including panthers. And, they just were amazed at the wonder, all the natural wonder here. So it's changed, unfortunately.
Is there any, did you gain any sense of what goods had more value in the trade? Some
of the deeds include, the values.
Mm.
And so the most value, and of course it would vary by volume or amount.
Mm.
But let's just speculate here. Maybe those goods that were most valuable came first on the list.
Mm-hmm.
And often it was cloth that came first, or clothing came first. Wampum, generally the Europeans would put wampum first, but I think that may have been their prejudice because it was money, so they would, just kind of put money first. But I am speculating, probably too far. But cloth would come first. Guns would come after. Ammunition. Usually alcohol would come at the end. Then if it was a large deed, you'd have a long list of various tools and gadgets that would be offered. So, and they were worth a lot less. And just on people are often interested in the guns and ammunition because there were some concerns about trading guns, because then they would be used on maybe other European nations. And there are a couple of things I would want to say. One is that the guns could be used for hunting, and that may be why the Lenapes really didn't use guns very often to kill Europeans in the Delaware Valley before 1750, in that time frame. So I think it was hunting, or they were trading them away. And I think that may have been a big part, especially with these large deeds. The Lenapes were requesting specific items in large quantities that they would then use in the fur trade. And they would purchase Canadian furs with these goods and the wampum. And in that way, keep the trade going. And they would bring the furs back and then trade that or them to the Europeans.
There's a question here. I'm in Trenton, so I wonder if you had information on the acquisition of land north of the Assunpink.
Well, there are deeds, and they're written in the recorded deeds in the New Jersey State Archives. And some of these same people, same sachems, who were involved in sales south of the Assunpink were involved in those sales north of the Assunpink. But then there were other Lenapes or Munsees who were more involved north of the Assunpink and then up, in the Raritan area and farther north and east, actually. And a really good book to read for relations between the Dutch and the English and the Lenapes or Munsees is Robert Grummet's The Munsee Indians. It was published about 2009. And it's a good book for learning more about sachems in this area as well, because there was a lot of interchange. But his focus really is north of the Assunpink, north of the Raritan, towards Manhattan, and then north up through the Hudson. But I would recommend that book.
Well, viewers out there, if you have any last questions, you could type them out now. I'll just wait a minute. There seems to be a delay. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you very much for coming out on a blustery night and sharing all this with us. I'm glad we moved the broadcast into the meeting room from the hall.
It's lovely here. Yeah. Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
You're welcome.
And thank you everyone for attending.
Thanks for coming through. Thanks all around.
Thank you.